We're going to be talking to Annette from Cashflow Mastery, who's going to help us understand our finances and the wonderful goals that we can set. One of the expenses she's going to talk about is property management, and it's really important to understand all of your budgeting so you can get the best bang for your buck and build the best future that you can. Thanks for joining us today, Annette from Cashflow Mastery. If you could just first tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do to help people.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me, Nathan. It's great to be here. So my background is in finance. Back in the day, I did a business degree and I always knew I wanted to be in business. I didn't quite know what, but I wanted to have a life that was a little bit more fruitful. And so I decided, I'm going to get into business. So before I did that, I moved to Australia and decided, I'm going to make a life over here. So that was 20 odd years ago or more. And I met my now husband, Andrew, quite soon after I arrived here. And one of his biggest drivers was that he saw his parents separate over money, or they separated. And money was one of the big contributing factors. And he didn't see his parents because his mum was working 3 jobs. And so he was quite driven, and he wanted to make a go of it financially for himself so that he didn't end up in that same situation. Whereas I was a bit more conservative. Like, I loved business and things like that, but I was probably a bit less risky than he was. But I've now come to realise you do need to take some risks, calculated risks, in order to get ahead. So it sounds a bit geeky, but one of our first dates was actually going to a real estate information night. So we actually went along, and he was like, I really want to invest in real estate. And I was like, well, that sounds really cool. I'd known about shares and things growing up because my dad had a share portfolio and things like that. So he was quite good with money and, provided for us quite well and things like that. But I didn't know anything about property. So I went along and got really excited when I could see the value of property and property investing. And within about 6 months, Andrew and I bought our first property together. It was actually an investment property. We didn't buy our own home until probably 5 to 10 years later. So we were the typical rent investors, I suppose.
Wow.
So we rented for quite some time in a very modest studio apartment that didn't have a proper kitchen back in Sydney.
Wow.
So and one of the things I did was read up a lot on personal finance and understand how I could get ahead financially by making some sacrifices today. And when you're in your 20s, you can pretty much do that. You don't have a huge outlay, you don't have a lot of costs typically, depending on your lifestyle. So we kind of did it tough for a bit, but put large chunks of our income away in order to invest and sort of make a sacrifice today for a better tomorrow kind of thing.
Wow.
And so that's how we started out. And we then both went on. He was headhunted to come and work with a financial planner. And they were in the heydays of when property was just going gangbusters, sort of early 2000s. And he was traveling a lot with this financial planner, going around to different places and also presenting. He was also into property, but he had shares as well and financial planning. And because they were so busy, I would come and help him on weekends and evenings and things like that and see what he was doing. And I was like, this looks really cool. So I ended up working there. He offered me a job. And so we worked there doing finance broking for a little while. Anyway, one thing led to another, and we went back overseas to see my family. And when we came back, we decided, we're either going to get some equity in this business and become partners, or we're going to go out and do our own thing. So that's what we decided to do. So in 2003, we set up our own business, threw caution to the wind, had an office in North Sydney. And the beautiful thing was that this financial planner continued to send clients our way. So he was obviously very happy with us and the things that we did. And these people were people who had a lot of equity in their property and they wanted to invest. So they wanted to invest into a share portfolio and predominantly into property so that they could grow their wealth for the future. So we've been doing that for the better part of 20 years. And more recently, I've branched out and gone more into coaching. So actually helping younger people to get established and to do what we did sort of 20 years ago and to develop and grow financially, predominantly using property as that main vehicle.
That is fantastic. What an amazing story. And I kind of think of the statistics in Australia where We have the second highest level of personal debt in the whole world. I think after Switzerland, the average Australian has a debt of $20,000, and yet you and Andrew somehow managed to escape that and were willing to sacrifice in the short term for the long-term gain of developing your wealth, and now you're in a position to help other people to do it. What kind of advice would you give to somebody who has a car loan or a personal loan and is struggling and doesn't really see the light that you guys obviously saw? What is it that they need to do so that they can kind of follow in your footsteps and build their own financial future?
Yeah, definitely. Look, obviously, you know, as a young person, we all need a car and we all need to get around. And we typically, if we've got some student debt or just debt for moving out of home and all different things, so I can understand how it comes about, but it does become a trap. And I actually call it a wealth destroyer. Credit card debt is one of the worst types of debt. You know, we're talking on average 20% interest rate. So what we need to do is work out a plan and have a strategy. So that's where I come in when I sit down with my clients. If they've got debt, which most people have, we work out a plan on how we're going to eradicate that. So there's always it's interesting because a lot of people say, well, should I start saving or should I pay off my debt? And there's no one size fits all, but absolutely I would say that we need to kind of tackle both. We need to it depends on the income as well. So we need to be in a position where we've got some savings that we can put towards getting into assets. But if we're struggling so much that we can't even put a penny aside, then we need to really tackle the debt first. So I would say that if you're paying anything over 8% in interest, you really need to start working on that first and tackling that and getting rid of it as much as possible. And whether that's taking on that second job, just doing what you can, making a little bit of a sacrifice, because otherwise it's a bit of a trap and it can cause people to lose 10, 20, 30 years of their life. And when you're young, you've got the most opportunity to make a go of things, because we all know the eighth wonder of the world is compound interest. So if you start young, you've got a much better chance at creating wealth for yourself. So it's really about lining your ducks up, and that's where I come in and I teach people the strategies and put them a plan together. And part of that is teaching them about what's coming in and what's going out. Where does your money go? And a lot of people don't know where their money goes, and a lot of people are just trying to make ends meet. But when they actually look at where their money is going, they realize there's a lot of money leakage within their expenses, and we can tidy that up and we can really start to make some changes.
That sounds fantastic. Before we get into the actual budgeting and planning, what kind of vehicles do you think are a good thing for people to start looking into? What kind of vehicles for wealth generation? Do you think stocks are good, or property investment, or putting money aside in a savings account? What would you suggest to somebody who's just starting out on this journey?
So if you're just starting out, one of the things that I did that made a massive difference was when I was working back in Sydney. I was on a very modest salary. I was probably earning maybe $40,000. And at the time, I put aside no less than 10% of my income. I think it was more like 15%. If you can do more, even better. But what I did back then is I put it into a high interest savings account. So again, compound interest. And I think obviously depending on where interest rates are and what the returns are at the moment, because interest rates are high, you are getting good returns. If you put your money aside, you've got to look at the right type of facility. That's probably one of the best places to put your money until you're ready to invest. It's not an investment in of itself, because at the end of the day, if you're earning 4 to 5% return on your money in the bank, you're still actually going backwards when you take into account the cost of living and inflation. So it's a method in which that you can generate enough money so that you can invest into assets that outperform inflation, whether it be stocks or property. Property is my area of expertise, so I'm a bit biased with that. I do own shares as well, but property is where I've made most of my money, and I continue to love it, and I continue to see an absolute no-brainer, if you like, when it comes to property investment.
What do you like about, you've chosen property investment as your vehicle. Why did you pick property investment over shares? We know that not everyone's going to agree with you, which is fine, but you've chosen that. You've obviously done a lot of research into that and made your decision, and it's obviously worked out well for you. So what kind of things were going through your mind when you made that decision?
There's probably three things. The first one is the capital growth. So if you go back to sort of World War II, I think it is, when the record started, or maybe it was a little bit earlier than that, property on average has appreciated by at least 8% per annum over that time. Sometimes it does more, sometimes it does less, but over an average, as we've seen in the last couple of years, there's been certain pockets that have done 20% or more. So it's done really, really well. So capital appreciation, that sort of money you can't save.
Right.
You know, nobody after tax can save the kind of money that property, when it appreciates and when it does well, held over the long term. I'm not talking about buying and selling in a short period of time. I'm talking about holding for the long term.
Okay.
So capital appreciation is one.
Yep.
Number two is the leverage. Okay. Leverage meaning you can gear the property. Gearing means borrowing against the asset.
Yeah.
To invest in it.
That sounds scary, Annette. Borrowing money. I think we all get scared when we think of borrowing money.
That's right.
You know, especially our parents, you know, if we tell them, I'm going to borrow money, they think, oh, no, you're going to be in debt forever.
Yeah, and it's a really good point, because if you understand debt, there is actually good debt and there's bad debt.
Okay.
So it's understanding the difference. Now, bad debt or consumer debt is when you're borrowing to pay for your lifestyle, pay for things that go down in value, like cars, holidays, going, you know, all those kinds of things that aren't going to bring you a return.
Okay.
Whereas good debt, you could describe good debt as something that's going to help you hold an asset that's going to appreciate in value. Right. So whilst you're going into debt, the debt can become tax deductible if it's for an investment. Okay. And it can also help you to reduce your taxable income. Okay. And it can also help you to hold that asset. And at the end of the day, the bank would not lend you the money if it didn't think that the asset that you're investing in is safe. And we all know the saying, safe as houses, right?
Yes.
So banks will lend all day long against a property, as long as it's the right kind of property, and they've got to come and do evaluation and make sure the property exists and that they've got a proper kitchen, and that they could basically, if you didn't pay your loan, that they could sell it in a heartbeat to somebody else. They've got to make sure they're happy with the security, but they'll lend to you all day long on that. Whereas with shares, it's a different story.
Yes, yeah.
Shares are you investing in other people's business.
Right.
Right? So you're putting your faith in somebody else running a business profitably and doing well, and you're owning a percentage of that company. Okay, so you're completely reliant on the people running that business to derive an income for you. Okay, so there's nothing wrong with that, but you've got to know what you're getting into, eyes wide open. And businesses can be sold, bought and sold, changed. Management can come in and change. Whereas with property, it's sort of, for me, it's real, it's tangible. You know, we're sitting in a room now, it's a property. Yes. It sits on land. Yes. And we all know that it's the land that appreciates in value, and it's the buildings that depreciate. Yeah. So it's the land that is really where the value lies. Right. And so when you buy a house, it's really, the house can come and go within. You hold a house for 100 years, for example, that house may not be there, but the land will always be there.
The land will go up.
And the land is what we've got. You know, we're scarce. We've only got a certain amount of land, if you like, whereas we can change the house. We can build a couple of houses on the same block. We can go up and build an apartment story, things like that. Yeah. So land is tangible. We can touch, we can feel the house and things like that. So that's my second point. So we've got capital appreciation. We've got the leverage the bank will lend you. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there's other criteria to be able to borrow that money. Right. And then third of all, property brings you a cash flow. So somebody's in that property renting it, paying you rent, and that rent can cover your costs.
Wow, that's really, really interesting. And just on that point of leverage, I think it's really interesting you mentioned good debt, because it makes me think that the benefit of a debt too is that if you've borrowed money, let's say $100,000, and you get a growth in the asset that you've got, you get the full growth based on the level of debt that you've borrowed.
Correct.
So instead, if you were in the stock market and you only had $10,000, you'd only make a profit on that $10,000. But if you've leveraged yourself and you've borrowed other people's money, then on that good debt that you talked about, you're actually making a profit on the full amount of the debt that you've borrowed, which is another great advantage as well.
Yeah, look, absolutely. The return on investment is huge when you take into account. You might, to buy a $500,000 property, you might only put in $50,000. Yes. The rest is borrowed by the bank. Yeah. And so you're getting the capital appreciation on the 500. Whereas, as you said rightly, if you were buying a share portfolio for 500,000, you need to put in 500,000.
Exactly right. And the other thing you mentioned I thought was interesting about the stock market too is, with property, if you buy in a suburb, generally speaking, everything in that suburb goes up. Whereas if you buy on the stock market, it's not every single share that goes up. So you can't just buy a share and then expect it to go up in value. You're really rolling the dice whether you pick the right share or not. But with property, as long as you've picked a good location, then everything in that suburb is more likely to go up for you as well.
Yeah, it comes back to doing your research around what do you need. So this is, again, it comes back to the planning and the structure.
Right.
So, we work out a plan about what people need. What do they need to live on? What's their aspirations? How long do they think they want to work till? And then we work backwards and say, okay, you need X amount of equity in order for you to have an income at, say, 5% return in your retirement. And so we sort of work backwards. And obviously picking a location is part of that, but also the cash flow is very important, because if you don't have enough cash flow to support your investments, things can go pear-shaped. And so it's really important that you understand what the cash flow is of your properties. And that's, again, where I come in and we work out a strategy and we work out what the numbers are, right?
Okay.
So it's a numbers game. It's like, treat it like a business.
Right.
So a business has income, a business has expenses, and then it either has a profit or a loss. And then we have, we don't want to get too technical, and I'm actually not a tax agent, so I can't advise on it.
Yep.
But obviously I've been doing this a long time. So you do have some on-paper costs that you can deduct as well.
Right.
So typically, even if that property might be costing you $50 a week, after tax, it might be costing you nothing and you're cash flow positive.
Fantastic. So that's a really important part, I think, because I know from experience and talking to friends is that a lot of people don't want to make the jump into doing something because they don't really understand what they're getting into, and that fear of the unknown, I think, stops a lot of people from getting in.
Yeah.
So what I guess you're saying, Annette, is that if people would just have that chance, or maybe come and see you, or just do some research about how to look into their numbers. Now, it does seem really scary to be looking into your numbers, and it sounds really boring as well. But I guess it's something really important to do, isn't it?
Look, it's essential. There's no getting around it, I'm afraid. And sometimes, it's a bit like, when you're a kid and you feel like there's a monster under your bed and you don't want to go to the toilet in the night in case it grabs your legs.
How did you know?
Because I think we've all been there, right?
Yeah,
I like that analogy because everyone can relate to it.
Yeah.
And then, you get up in the night and you get your torch and you shine your torch under the bed and you realise, actually,